So this narration is going to cover specific learning disorder. Just also note that I've also going to post another narration for intellectual disability, and so those are separate. So if you haven't seen the other one, just please make a note that it's there so you can also plan to review it as well. So specific learning disorder, you may have heard the term learning disorder or learning disabled, things like that. You may hear the term dyslexia, that kind of factors into this a little bit as well, and so we'll talk about that. So this is the current language in the DSM-5. In the DSM-4, they had 3 disorders that really kind of were separate from one another in some ways. They've been kind of integrated into this one disorder, and then you'll see about the specifiers, how those still play a part in the diagnosis here. So this slide and the next slide we'll talk about the clinical description or kind of a summary of the DSM-5 criteria for specific learning disorder. So, you know, the general kind of theme here, or the main point is that these are difficulties in learning and using. Those are both important parts of this academic skills. And so the individual needs to exhibit at least one of these symptoms here on this slide as a starting point. And as I mentioned, that continues on to the next slide as well. And so you can see that they kind of break down in terms of reading, writing, and then math. And so that kind of gives you the 3 areas. Now, it really just has to be one of these criteria to get us started, as I mentioned. So the first is inaccurate or slow and effortful word reading. So this can be, you know, individuals who are guessing at words. They have difficulty sounding things out. They read words wrong, and that in turn causes them to read slowly, and it takes a lot of effort on their part. The second point is really talking about reading comprehension. So this is, you know, understanding what you're reading, making sense of it. The next 2 points deal with spelling, so difficulty spelling. So this could be, you know, adding, omitting, substituting letters. Some people have that issue mainly with vowels, and some, you know, do it more with consonants and things like that. And so spelling is an issue. And then written expression, the next point, is really dealing more with things like lack of clarity in writing, difficulty forming paragraphs and structuring paragraphs, trouble with grammar, punctuation, those kinds of things. And then the last 2 points, as you can see, focus on math, okay? And so the first is really just talking about number facts, the way to calculate things, sometimes get lost in the computation. They may switch procedures, like they're supposed to be adding and they're subtracting instead, have trouble with remembering or learning, you know, number facts like multiplication tables, those kinds of things. So that's what we're talking about there. And then the last point is difficulties in mathematical reasoning, which is, you know, thinking about how do you apply these math concepts. And that gets into things like word problems or story problems that you have to use some of those skills to be able to complete. Now the criteria go on and say that whatever the area of affected skill, so it could be reading, writing, or math, or a combination of those, it says that they're substantially below those expected. And so we'll talk about what that means in a little bit as we think about how do we diagnose specific learning disorder. So substantially below, well, again, we'll get back to that, of what's expected based on the individual's age, okay? And also that it causes significant interference with their academic or occupational performance. So some people who have specific learning disorder, for example, are getting along fine academically. They're struggling a little bit, but they're able to keep up and things like that. And then sometimes when the demands exceed the abilities, that's when you begin to see problems. So sometimes these problems, there's evidence of these problems early, but until the academic demands get more intense, we may not see them interfering with their academic or perhaps occupational performance for older individuals. Okay, and then the last point before we talk about the specifiers is that these learning difficulties begin during the school age years, and as I mentioned, we may not see them manifest themselves fully until some later point. Okay, now just a couple of other things I'll mention before we talk about the specifiers. This has to be occurring for at least 6 months, so it has to be persistent for at least 6 months, and it's continuing despite some interventions that are targeting those difficulties. So a teacher has identified that this is a problem, it's persisted for some time, and there's been some effort to try to help build skills or remediate skills in some of these areas, and yet the problems persist. Now the specifiers are really where we've gone from DSM-4 to DSM-5. So now we just have the single diagnosis, specific learning disorder, and then you would specify with impairment in reading, written expression, or mathematics, or it could be some combination of those. So it is possible to add more than one specifier in this case. Now just take a look at these problems. What I would encourage you to do is just take a moment, pause the recording at this point, and just work out these problems and show the work that you would do to do this, including borrowing and carrying and those kinds of things. So take a moment to do that. I'm going to go ahead and advance this, but if you pause and take a moment to solve those, that will be helpful for the next area. Okay, so in red you see the correct result for these problems. And above what you see is a child that has a specific learning disorder in the area of mathematics and how they solved these two problems. And so we'll start with the one on the right, 75 plus 8. And you could probably do that one in your head, but if you wrote it out, you know that you had to carry some values over and do that. And what you see here is that there was a problem in terms of how the computation was carried out. And so they started correctly. They added 8 and 5 and got a 13. So they wrote the 3 and carried the 1. But then when they went to add the second column, instead of just adding 7 and 1 to get 8, they added the 8 in again from the bottom row. Okay, and so they ended up with 16 instead of 8. And so that obviously had a pretty significant impact. So this could be one of those things where this is like a procedural thing or a way to carry out the calculation that was not done accurately. Now in the money problem on the left, we see, they weren't far off. It was 56.74 was the correct answer, and they're only off by about 40 cents here. But you can see they got confused. If you see the first part is right, so we're subtracting here. So 4 minus 0 is 4. And then there needed to be some borrowing in the next area, and this is where things got misaligned, right? So we see all that borrowing or carrying, I'm not even sure, to be honest with you, over the 2, and so, but it never got either written in the right place or things like that to get the computation right. So instead of carrying that 1 over beside the 0, they just kind of put it above the 2, and then that got them off in terms of this calculation here. And so so you can see some examples here of how those math skills, those computation skills, the procedural skills are important here. Now, how do we identify learning disorders? I'm going to talk about 3 methods. I'm going to start with the first one and then advance to the next slide and show you a little graph that kind of highlights this. And then we'll talk about the other 2. Okay, so one that's been used prominently is what we call IQ achievement discrepancy. So this is basically comparing one's intelligence through an IQ test, and this is really targeting, what are you capable of? Not what have you learned, but what are you capable of? What's your ability, right? And then you compare that to their achievement. And achievement tests are basically saying, okay, well, what have you learned in school? And so these are focused around those same areas, around reading, writing, and math. And certainly there's some correlation between intelligence and achievement, but this is a different type of test, okay? And so let me just advance here and show you this graph. So, so in the DSM-4, one of the things that was prominent in terms of the language was there was a significant discrepancy between this IQ and achievement, okay? And so we've talked in the past an average IQ score is 100, and so let's just operate from that example here and say that this child has an IQ score of 100. But when we assess their ability in reading through an achievement test, we find that their reading score is 68. And this is a similar scale to IQ. So a mean score of 100, standard deviation of 15. And so what we would say is that that discrepancy between 100 in their intelligence and a 68 in their reading is significant, right? And so and previously that was one of the primary criteria we used to diagnose a learning disorder. Now the problem here that we may run into is that let's say that the child has an IQ of 130 or even 125. If we now look at that discrepancy and we say, well, their reading score is 100, some people argue that that's still average. It's okay, right? And so there may be a discrepancy there, but then we have to look at, okay, well, is it impacting functioning and things like that? So that's the first way. So the first way is that IQ achievement discrepancy. Sorry, there we go. The second thing that we're thinking about is below average achievement. And so this is really kind of more what the current DSM-5 language talks about. And so we're saying that their performance is below the age or the grade level in at least one academic area, so reading, writing, or math. And so the question becomes, well, how far below do they have to be, right? And so that can vary from state to state. It can vary from school district to school district. And so this is an important question. So some standardization here would be helpful, but we unfortunately don't have that. And so and the other thing to think about is if you have a younger child who's significantly below age or grade level, that may be more impactful than somebody who's in 11th grade. Let's say that you're in 11th grade and you're at a 9th grade math level. Well, that's 2 grade levels below, but you still have some pretty healthy math skills if you're working at math in a 9th grade level. Now, if you're in 3rd grade and you have 1st grade reading skills, for example, that discrepancy is going to be more impactful because those reading skills are important moving forward, right? So if you're stuck at a 1st grade level, that can be problematic, as you might imagine. The last is what we call response to intervention, okay? And so this is, again, kind of back to that. Let's identify children who may be at risk. Let's provide some intervention, okay? And if they don't respond, then that's where we may consider this to be a learning disorder, okay? And so that sounds good, right? And I like that it provides some intervention early. The question is, or the concerns are, what are valid interventions that we can use? And often the problem is there some ability to implement these interventions prior to a diagnosis being offered? And so currently our system is operating largely under, hey, we'll provide services, but we need a diagnosis before we can do that. And so this is kind of circumventing that. And so it kind of doesn't always fit with process and procedure. Some statistics. What I will say is we know the most about reading problems. And so when you think about specific learning disorder with the specifier focused on reading, you may also hear that referred to as dyslexia. And so those terms are used interchangeably. This is really DSM-5 language, but it's really saying the same thing. So we know reading impairments are the most common. Estimates somewhere between 4 and 10% of children. The data suggests that boys are affected more often than girls, but part of this may be influenced by what we've talked about previously, in that boys have more externalizing problems, which may get them referred more often for services, and perhaps during the course of those services, they're more likely to be identified. So it may be an identification issue here, which could be problematic. So that's why those data are a little bit unclear. What we do know is that this is important. Students who are diagnosed with specific learning disorder, more likely to drop out of school, more likely to face unemployment later in life, and more likely to engage in suicidal behavior as well, perhaps part of the self-esteem and some of the things that are going on here. So identification and intervention are really key. So let's talk about that intervention piece. So treatment requires, again, we have to identify it and then offer the educational intervention. So kind of a two-pronged approach. So specific skills instruction, right? So procedures, like if this is how you complete an addition problem, this is how you structure a paragraph, those kinds of things. So specific skills. And then the strategy is, what do we do with it? Okay, so when do we need to use this? Why do we use it? And how can we implement it? Those kinds of things. So it's likely to be kind of both. So make sure that we have the skills first of all, and then we can teach the ability to implement those skills. And so just a last point here I'll make is that interestingly, some imaging studies have looked at brain function. So this would be like something like functional MRI, brain function prior to an intervention and then following, post-intervention. And what they find is that not only do skills improve, but we see positive changes in how the brain is functioning, and we see it closer to what we would expect, if you will. If we have kind of a normal or a baseline level of functioning, it moves towards that with intervention, which is, again, I talked about this with OCD, but I think it's really interesting that we can implement things it this way, and it can change, these neural networks in positive ways that perhaps will carry forward over time. Okay, so that specific learning disorder, I hope these narrated PowerPoints have been helpful, and you can let me know if you have any questions.